you everyone for coming today. I'm Dan Raven, and this is the Branford Forum. We have a sign-up sheet for our email list. So if you'd like to be informed of future programs in the fall, then just write your name beautifully, legibly, so I can add you to our email list. We have about 470 people who are subscribers, and we have an open rate of over 40%. So the people who are on the email list find it useful and open it.
And we don't bother you too much.
We don't bother you too much or too little, just the right amount. And we don't share it, and if you ever want to be removed from it, just tell us and it'll be done. So anyway, we'll pass this around. If you're on the list already, if you've been getting emails from me, you're there, so it's not necessary. Okay. So this is the last program of the spring, and in the fall we have 4, probably 5 speakers who will come. 2 weeks ago we had Jacob Hacker, who had to cancel for medical reasons, so we're looking to have him in the fall. We have Naftali Kaminsky, a Yale pulmonologist, who's going to talk about what men can do to fight gender inequality and sexual harassment in healthcare. Ann Dutton from the Stress Center at Yale will talk about mindfulness-based stress reduction. Olivia Dreyer will talk about healing ethnic trauma, and she's worked in Bosnia and Rwanda and Myanmar, and she's brought people together who have experienced tribal or ethnic atrocities, and so she's doing some great work, and that should be very interesting. And Robert Post from the Yale Law School will talk about election law. Now, on that sign-up sheet, there's a place at the bottom where you can add any topics that you're interested in, and that election law was one of the most popular things, gerrymandering, etc. So we've responded to that and gotten a really great speaker to fill that. We don't have the exact dates yet. We're talking to the library about what's available, but we'll send that out. And if you write down your email, you will get those dates from them. So, President Trump recently signed a $686 billion defense spending bill. Of course, we in Connecticut benefit substantially from these federal dollars. We produce helicopters, jet engines, submarines, and other sophisticated instruments of war. Are there other tools that we can use other than the military to support the safety and prosperity of the United States in the international realm? That's the big question. So today's speaker, Andy Sisson, recently retired from a long career at USAID, the Agency for International Development. He served in many fascinating places around the world, in Africa and Asia, but he decided, for reasons unknown, to settle in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where he consults for FHI 360, and he will be teaching both at the University of North Carolina and at Duke University. So his topic today is U.S. aid and U.S. foreign policy. So join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you all very much for coming on a Saturday afternoon to hear about a very obscure topic. And I hope, I'm thinking about the topics that Dan mentioned coming up in the fall. I hope I won't contribute too much to your stress level. Foreign policies these days can be quite stressful. He talked about, one of the speakers will speak about reconciliation, another will speak about elections, and I'll touch on that a bit. So I had 35 years in the Foreign Service with U.S. Agency for International Development. My wife, Karen, who's here, was also a Foreign Service officer with the State Department. So we traveled around the world and had some assignments together in some pretty interesting places. Full disclosure, our MC here, our host, our master organizer is my cousin. And so finally, my family's going to get to hear a little bit about it too. So I'm going to speak about the role of foreign assistance, U.S. government provided foreign assistance, its role in U.S. foreign policy. As you can see from the name U.S. Agency for International Development, a top priority for providing foreign aid is development around the world. But it's not by any means the only objective, the only reason why we provide foreign aid. Foreign aid is a foreign policy tool. And that's going to be my major point that I'm going to cover in different ways today. Foreign aid is a foreign policy tool to help achieve foreign policy objectives on behalf of Americans in promoting U.S. interests. What those are depends on our leadership, the country or region we're talking about, and the period of time we're talking about. It can all change. So I'll give some examples, drawing mostly on my experience over history to illustrate how foreign aid has supported U.S. foreign policy objectives in different places. But let me begin by telling you first about me. I'm from Boston. And when I grew up, one of the most famous, colorful politicians from the Boston area was Tip O'Neill. And you may remember one of his most important political principles is all politics is local. You've heard that. Well, I'm going to try to convince you also that U.S. foreign assistance is also local. Who here has heard of the nonprofit Save the Children Federation? Have any of you donated to Save the Children? Yeah, some of you have. So if you have, then you have co-financed with the U.S. government Save the Children work overseas. So I've worked with Save the Children, which is based just half an hour from here in Fairfield, Connecticut, on projects, humanitarian relief, supporting refugees and refugee camps in such far-flung places as Somalia, Kosovo, and more recently Indonesia. They're a wonderful NGO, a non-governmental organization. So most U.S. foreign assistance isn't just a check. It may be if it's to Israel, and we'll talk about that. But in general, it's for investments, it's for projects. And most of that foreign assistance is implemented by American organizations, sometimes host country local organizations, like Save the Children, CARE. Another really great nonprofit based here in Connecticut is called TechnoServe. And they're involved in small business development and using new technologies to promote development in developing countries. We work a lot with universities. Yale, for instance, we have projects. I think we have in the past with the University of Connecticut. So U.S. aid in providing foreign assistance on behalf of American taxpayers has projects with literally hundreds of American organizations. Every land-grant university, for-profit firms, nonprofits. So a lot of the taxpayer dollars are actually coming back home. But for people like me who came into USAID, I didn't know about all that foreign policy stuff. I came in because I was interested in development. This is what I studied in school. I just got really excited about developing countries and their problems and eradicating poverty. Whoops. Sorry, I went to the wrong place in the show. So what is development? I'll talk about other foreign policy objectives, but let's start with development. The UN in 2015, brokered an international consensus on what is development. 17 goals, literally over 100 sub-goals. And number one is eradicating poverty. In the year 2000, there was an earlier set of goals called the Millennium Development Goals, also brokered by the UN. There were only 8 goals at that point, but number one was also eliminating poverty. For me, a couple of the real standout additions in this new consensus in 2015 is cities, urbanization has become very important as a global trend in developing countries. And another is peace and justice. Since the end of the Cold War, and particularly in the last decade, there has been a big increase in conflict in many developing countries, which is just a terrible break on development, human well-being. So now there is a goal centered on conflict prevention, conflict mitigation. The US government was a lead participant in negotiating with all of the other members at the UN this consensus on development. Before I get into what the US government does with foreign assistance and our foreign policy, I just want to note that other governments do it too. Notably, the French and the British, welcome, there's seats right here, provide foreign aid largely targeted on their former colonies, mostly in Africa, but elsewhere. And why do they do it? Because they want to have influence with the governments of those former colonies. My first experience really learning about development up close was in Cameroon. And I lived with a couple of Cameroonian researchers. We also teamed up with a French doctor. And we were looking at the social and economic and health consequences of a big rice project financed by the French government and the World Bank and some Cameroonian government money. And we spent a lot of time interviewing farmers and speaking to the French administrators, just what is going on with this project. And the purpose of the project was, from the World Bank and French point of view, and why the Cameroonian government signed on to the loans, was to reduce the need for foreign exchange to import rice. As Cameroon was urbanizing, it needed more rice for its consumers, and Cameroon was spending a lot of money to import rice. So they wanted to produce rice locally. The second objective was to increase farmer incomes. On both of those scores, the project was successful. Farm incomes went up, less need for rice imports, saving foreign exchange. But I learned a couple of important things there that have served me well in the rest of my career following my research there. One is beware of unintended consequences. We see that a lot in all parts of our lives. But this affects thousands of families who are extremely poor. One of the unexpected unintended consequences, which we researched with a French doctor, was over 80% of the farmers. By the way, these are women transplanting rice. They grow the seedlings in a nursery and then they transplant it in a row. And it's like 105 degrees when they do this. And it's only women who do this task. One of the unintended consequences is the incidence of bilharzia, a debilitating disease, was 85% for the people working in the rice zone. And it was about 20% for people outside the rice zone. This leads to blindness. It's debilitating. I can tell you about other unintended consequences, but I'll leave it at that for now. Another important thing...
What is that? How did it happen?
Pardon me?
That big word you used, what's that disease and how did it happen?
Bilharzia, another name is schistosomiasis. The vector is snails that develop in standing water.
Parasite, isn't it?
It's a parasite. So the other important thing I learned that I want to share with you is how important it is to understand local perspectives. Projects won't work well. They'll go in the wrong direction if you don't understand what it is the people want and what they're doing, what their motivations are. So I remember vividly in this project, in the western zone, farmers were notorious for doing a lousy job farming their rice fields. And the French technical experts said it's because the farmers in the western zone of the project were lazy and they were thieves. That was their understanding. Well, we spent a lot of time living with those farmers. And we learned that, in fact, they were earning more money doing other stuff. Because they had better land for other crops, they had livestock. So they could just make more money doing other stuff because they weren't getting paid enough for rice. So we told the government, this is what's going on. They're not lazy, they're not thieves. In fact, they're really smart, rational actors. And if you want them to buy into this project, you need to pay them more for their rice. And to the government's credit, they raised the price of rice, which was also a good lesson that once in a while, evidence can actually inform policy. The first U.S. the major experience, foreign aid as we know it, is the Marshall Plan. But I've been doing a little bit of research. U.S. foreign assistance actually goes back to the 19th century, providing humanitarian assistance in Latin America and Europe under Herbert Hoover. But the first major investment with economic and political objectives leading to the way we operate today is the Marshall Plan that happened following World War II. And as this was Harry Truman, General Marshall, Paul Hoffman. He was the president of Studebaker, and he became the chief administrator of the Marshall Plan. And then that's Averell Harriman, who you may know as governor of New York, but at the time he was Truman's Secretary of Commerce. And Harry Truman was really pragmatic in getting the Marshall Plan adopted. As you know, following World War II, Western Europe was almost in paralysis. Tens of millions of refugees, destroyed infrastructure, breakdown in trade, broke up stock production. And the US government was concerned that communism in the Soviet Union was just going to move in, as it was starting to do in places like Greece and Turkey. So $13.3 billion investment for 16 countries. In today's dollars, that's $130 billion. And those are the objectives. Imagine President Truman, a Democrat, getting this passed by a Republican Congress. So he was quoted as saying, I love this quote. Truman is quoted as saying, "Can you imagine the plan's chances of passage in an election year in a Republican Congress if it is named for Truman and not Marshall?" So, smart guy. So the Marshall Plan was pretty successful. It stopped the slide towards chaos, rebuilt infrastructure. This is rebuilding some buildings in Germany, which was one of the beneficiaries. Trade, investment, restored production, infrastructure, and stability. It also led to the precursors of economic integration in Europe, which is an important principle in the Marshall Plan. Let me talk about foreign assistance, how it's organized in the U.S. government now. USAID, U.S. Agency for National Development, was created by President John F. Kennedy in 1961, and it was bringing together the remnants of the Marshall Plan and other foreign assistance efforts going on, mostly in Europe. Policy, and this is Kennedy speaking to USAID country directors, the White House. Policy direction for foreign aid comes from the White House, the National Security Council, the State Department, sometimes even within USAID. It depends on how important, how political the situation is. If it's Kosovo as the war is ending, or if it's Afghanistan during the war, the White House is going to be leading meetings on this all the time. If it's Malawi, they don't care. USAID is the largest, has historically been and still is the largest US government provider of foreign aid. It's about 60–65%. But other agencies are involved as well. Department of State, Agriculture, new agencies of the Millennium Challenge Corporation set up under President Bush, and the International Development Finance Corporation, which was just set up last October, but it's an expansion of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and a lending arm of USAID. But very important is congressional oversight. Budget and policy come from the Congress. And I'll talk about that, how this comes together in some of my slides coming up. On the ground overseas, this is mirrored by the American Embassy. The ambassador is the president's representative in country, and he or she has a team called the country team. And me as a USAID mission director would be on the country team. Other agency heads would be on the team. And we talk about policy in the country and what foreign aid is doing and what other things we should be doing. Policy direction is articulated in what we call national security strategy. In 1985, Congress passed a law requiring each new president to make public a national security strategy within 150 days of taking office. So Presidents Bush and Obama each did 2. And in December 2017, President Trump did his national security strategy. And these are all available online, either on the White House website or State Department website. And if you have a chance to look at it, I was really surprised how much the Bush and Obama strategies have in common. How important it is to promote development, democracy, and human rights as foreign policy objectives and projecting American values. How foreign assistance as well as diplomacy are really important for promoting all of our foreign policy objectives overseas, whether it's development or growing the markets for US exports, countering violent extremism. Foreign aid and development get huge play by both of these presidents. If you look at Trump's strategy, diplomacy, development, foreign aid, democracy, human rights are largely absent. It's all about not only America first, but also about defense and the military instrument. Not much at all on foreign aid, development, and diplomacy. But whatever policy is, it may not matter a lot, depending on where the money goes. You can have all this great rhetoric, but if all the money's going to 5 countries, then maybe policy doesn't matter too much. So if you look at, 2017 is the last year where there's really complete data on US government foreign aid. As you can see, these 5 countries, Israel, 1 down, Ethiopia, 5. These 5 countries accounted for nearly half of US foreign assistance. We provide foreign aid to well over 100 countries. These 5, almost half. 2017, the amount of foreign aid went up a lot following 9/11, and these are the top 5. Israel and Egypt, most of the foreign aid is security assistance. It's not civilian assistance like what I did. Just a question, how many of the United States government budget, what percentage of the US government budget do you think goes for US foreign aid? Any guesses?
0.1%.
What?
0.1%.
1%.
It's less than half of 1%.
Of the budget, you're right, it's 1%, give or take a tiny bit. As a percentage of our economy, GDP, it's 0.17%. On absolute terms, we are the largest donor. We're the largest economy. In terms of percentage of our economy, of all of the significant donors, we rank second from the bottom, above only Ireland. Whereas countries like Netherlands and Canada and the UK, they're close to 1%. We're at 0.17 or 0.18%. And of our foreign aid, about both of these years, about 70%, 72% is for civilian assistance, and the balance for security assistance.
Excuse me, in 2000, Russia, what's the return to us from giving money to Russia?
So this was following the breakup of the Soviet Union. So there was a big shift in resources, including creating embassies in the stands, to try to promote free market economy and democratic institutions. That's finished.
Excuse me, when you say security assistance, are you talking jet planes and missiles, or what do you mean?
It could be hardware, it could be training.
Could be training.
Yep.
So you're talking, the security thing you're talking is pretty hard.
Yeah, it could be.
Okay.
It's military.
It's military, yes.
Military.
Okay, I'm now going to turn to some examples from where I work. So my first post was Mogadishu in the 80s. We had a T-shirt that had a picture of a palm tree and it said Somalia, a garden spot like no other. And it was actually it was a crazy assignment, but it was a great assignment. And because of the Cold War, Somalia was our ally in the Cold War. And as you can see, it's in a strategic location near the Gulf. So a lot of oil gets shipped around Somalia. So Somalia was the #1 US aid recipient in Africa while I was there. This was despite the fact that it was a military dictatorship and a largely corrupt and dysfunctional government. But the priority for providing foreign aid was to have their support for us in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. So we had projects in infrastructure, education, health, agriculture, clean water, but the #1 priority for our USAID projects was rehabilitating the ports at Kismayo and Berbera. So this is a project we did rehabilitating the Kismayo port with the US Navy, because that way the Navy would have a good place to dock their ships. We would have rehabilitated the port at the capital of Mogadishu, but the Soviets had recently done their port before the flipping of the alliances. To be honest with you, many of our projects were not successful in Somalia. And people question, why are we giving so much foreign aid to a totally uncommitted, corrupt, dysfunctional government? I would go to government offices to work with somebody in a project, and maybe somebody would be in their office a couple hours a day. But the reason why is for security objectives, broadly speaking, was a strategic interest. And that competes against pure development objectives. So at any rate, they were our largest aid recipient until Siad Barre, the dictator, collapsed in the 90s. And since then, sadly, our foreign aid has been very large, but it's been focused on humanitarian support. A much more rewarding assignment was Malawi in the 1990s. Leading up to this, Africa had been going through economic decline, a widespread drought, a lot of bad press and alarming photos and stories in the United States. And Congress got very interested and provided legislation and funding for the Development Fund for Africa, where we could really focus on development in Africa. It wasn't about the Cold War. It wasn't about a lot of other foreign policy objectives. We could focus on development. And Malawi was a really good example of that. We had a large program. It was a government that was going through a political transition. We supported elections. And the dictator of 30 years, Banda, who was actually a medical doctor trained in the United States, he lost. And he stepped aside, and Akili Maluzi became president. And some good reforms started taking place. So this was a good environment to do development work. And one of my favorite projects was the Malawi Girls Education Project, where we worked on incentives and textbooks and curriculum and teacher training to try to get girls' enrollment to match that of boys, because it was severely lagging because of poverty and social biases. And by the time we left, 4 years later, girls' enrollment rate had increased by 56%.
What kind of religion was in Malawi?
Mostly Christian. The Maluzi, the president, was Muslim. My first experience working in a conflict situation with very intense political involvement was Kosovo, starting in '99. And you may recall that in the Balkans, this was an extremely turbulent place. Milosevic had put in place a policy of apartheid, and this was a government-dominated economy. The banks and the industries were all government-owned. And under the population was a majority ethnic Albanian. And under Milosevic, all of the Albanians were fired from their jobs, even though they were over 75% of the population. And they were kicked out of the universities. Teachers and students were kicked out of universities as well. So they had university in garages. And protests, other things were going on as well, like language policy. So there was an insurrection, and the Kosovo Liberation Army was going after the Serb government and police and military. And it escalated, and Milosevic started an ethnic cleansing campaign, and all ethnic Albanians were driven from their homes and either fled into the mountains or into neighboring countries. NATO came in, US led a NATO campaign, bombing, and the conflict ended. So the conflict ended in June, and USAID started, we set up a USAID program that summer. And I went out to Kosovo as Deputy Mission Director to open up the aid program following the war. And what we found when we arrived was a heavily traumatized society. The ethnic Albanians returned home to find, in half the cases, their homes were destroyed. Just literally destroyed. The other half weren't destroyed, but they were looted. Albanian businesses were destroyed or looted. And even worse, out of about 1.5 million ethnic Albanians, 11,000 were dead or missing, which is a tremendous number. They were traumatized and they were angry. And they went after the ethnic Serbs. And there were revenge killings going on when we arrived. maybe 1,000 Serbs out of maybe 300,000 population were killed. This was a very, very unstable situation. So when we arrived, our priorities were, first of all, humanitarian relief. Organizations like Save the Children, International Rescue Committee, Doctors Without Borders, just to provide food, shelter, water, healthcare. But we also wanted to help calm the place down, stabilize it. It's in the middle of the Balkans. Turkey and Greece, both NATO allies, were on the opposite sides of the conflict. It was very volatile, and it was spilling over into neighboring countries. So we focused on reconstruction as fast as we could, rebuilding commercial areas and cities, sending up lending programs so people could reestablish their businesses. And then we moved on to setting up institutions for a market economy and democracy. We supported the creation of an election system so that Kosovars could run elections. We set up a Ministry of Finance, and we hired the first Minister of Finance, an Australian guy who was head of the government budget of Australia, and the Deputy Minister of Finance, who was head of the budget of the government of the state of Washington. But their job was to train Kosovars and create a tax system to take over, which they did. We also did the same with the banking system, and the first head of the central bank was a Korean woman hired from the IMF, and we brought in the Federal Reserve System from the US to train Kosovars in how to supervise banks. Under this new banking system, the EU beat us to it and financed the first private bank. And we financed the second private bank, the American Bank of Kosovo. But we're proud because this one had the first ATM machine. And we sold it to Raiffeisen, which is an Austrian bank, which is very strong in the Balkans. And we took that money to set up a foundation that finances Kosovar kids to go to school in the US. I should mention that while we were there, I had a really exciting job. But Karen, my wife, had an even bigger job at the American Embassy. And once, when I was traveling with one of my Kosovar staff, she asked me in a very typically Albanian, frank way, she said, "Andy, what is it like to be married to somebody more important than you?"
What is your answer?
I'm used to it. And I know. And it's true. I mean, she had a direct line to the president's office. I was not operating in those political circles. But we were successful in helping stabilize the province. Yes?
What was the time frame for this?
Well, I was there, Karen and I were there 99 to 2002. And we set up an embassy and we set up USAID in the summer of '99, right after the war ended in June. So we hired everybody and we set up everything really fast. We worked very closely with NATO, particularly the US military. Kosovo was divided up into 5 military sectors. And the headquarters was like across the street above our office. We worked a lot with NATO elements to work. Every day there would be meetings, where we wanted to move humanitarian relief through some nonprofit to this village. But we would get security briefings every day from NATO saying, well, we've got intel that you can't go there today, you need to wait. Or it's fine, you can go there. And they might help us with transportation. They helped us redesign border crossings to make commodities flow better. And then sometimes we co-finance projects.
In this project, how many Americans and how many locals were on your team, roughly?
So we got up to about 100 staff in Kosovo, 90 Kosovars, and about 10 Americans. So we were successful in calming things down. We funded a lot of infrastructure. We worked a lot in the Serbian enclaves to help improve their lives and not just the Albanians. And we tried to bring them together on reconciliation, which was extremely hard.
Can you tell me what language you spoke to these people?
I used English. We had interpreters who spoke Albanian and Serbian. And as a result, the revenge killing stopped. Serbians feel free now to move throughout the province. The checkpoints are gone, the armored personnel carriers and tanks are gone, the barbed wire is gone. It feels like a more normal place. On the other hand, unemployment is still extremely high, and it's very aid dependent. So it's not pure success. My toughest assignment was a director in USAID, Pakistan. And in 2010, then Senator Kerry teamed up with Senator Richard Lugar, who just passed away, and a congressman named Berman, to create a new legislation to provide $1.5 billion a year in foreign aid for Pakistan. And 1.3 of that came through my office at USAID. That's on top of $700 million that we had in 2010 for humanitarian relief because of the flood. And the purpose of the legislation was to promote partnership between Pakistan and the US, trust, alliance, cooperation for the war effort next door in Afghanistan. Our foreign aid program, the top priority was energy, and the second priority was other infrastructure, particularly in the areas bordering Afghanistan. And in terms of infrastructure, we were pretty successful. We built over 1,000 kilometers of roads. We put electricity on the grid that reached 6 million people while I was there, and it went up higher after I left. But in terms of building trust between the US and Pakistan, it was, I felt like we were putting a finger on the dike. A lot of things happened while we were there, way above my pay grade, that worsened the relationship. A big one was, under the Obama administration, drone strikes going after terrorists in the border areas went way up. And the opposition political party, which controlled the government in the province of Punjab, which is the largest province in Pakistan, spoke out very, very strongly against the drone strikes and criticized the US heavily. And further, they canceled USAID programs in Punjab. So I needed to reprogram $250 million worth of projects, which the other provinces were very happy to take. And later, when we had the raid on bin Laden, which killed bin Laden, that took place in about 30 miles from where we lived in Islamabad. That further deteriorated the relationship. The Pakistanis were infuriated that we conducted this raid without consulting them and involving them. And there were reasons why we didn't, but we didn't. We didn't consult them. And they were infuriated. And they took out their wrath in many ways, including on us at USAID. They stopped the shipments of vaccines that we were bringing in. They harassed our staff. They followed me. They were really, really difficult to work with. They made it really hard to get visas. They were a very difficult government to work with. Following that, we went to Indonesia, which is a much more positive relationship. And Indonesia matters. It's like the biggest country that nobody knows anything about. It's at the time, the 17th largest economy in the world, third largest democracy, country with the largest Muslim population. This is a country that we want to promote as an ally in fighting terrorism, being a model of tolerance and democracy, economic growth. We're the largest foreign investor in Indonesia, so it's important for our business and our markets. So that's the framework at large for why USAID was there, even though it's a middle-income country. Our priorities focused on topics that matter to both of our countries. And they included climate change, marine biodiversity, and more broadly, just scientific collaboration. We were also involved in democracy promotion and education, but particularly climate change mattered because sadly, Indonesia overtook Brazil as having the world's highest rate of tropical deforestation. And it also has the world's second greatest biodiversity on land and highest biodiversity in marine life. And the reason why there is so much deforestation is because a lot of the forests are being converted to palm oil plantations. So we were attempting to work with the government and the private sector on stemming the deforestation. And the government said all the right things, but we didn't get very far because of corruption. And a lot of the government officials who were saying the right things were actually investing in the palm oil company. So we didn't make much headway. But in terms of scientific collaboration and working on marine issues, we did a lot better. We had 17 projects involving US and Indonesian universities doing research together, such as on marine biodiversity, on how to communicate to populations if there's a tsunami coming up in 5 minutes. We did stuff on maternal and child health with Johns Hopkins University. We helped Indonesia set up a science fund modeled after the National Science Foundation. And we brought in people from the US, from the National Science Foundation and National Academy of Sciences to help the Indonesians set that up. We also worked increasingly with the private sector. We had a great partnership with Coca-Cola that brought clean drinking water to 2 million Indonesians. We had a partnership that included McCormick Spices that worked on vanilla and other spice production in the poorest region of Indonesia called Papua. That's the vanilla connection. We worked with that same company many, many years earlier to develop the coffee industry in Indonesia, helping it to become one of the largest suppliers for Starbucks. So those give you some examples from my background of how USAID is used to promote different kinds of objectives, but it could be development, it could be stability, it could be environment, it could be democracy. I touched on those. Then I retired from aid exactly a year ago. And I wanted to talk a little bit about where USAID is now under this administration. The administrator of aid is Mark Green, who is a remarkably good choice to be the head of USAID. He's been a congressman, friend of Paul Ryan in Wisconsin, so he knows Congress, which is important. He was an ambassador to Tanzania when he was much younger. He was a school teacher in Kenya. He headed the International Republican Institute, which focuses on democracy promotion. He's a champion of human rights. He's a really good choice, and he's a very sensible guy. And what he's trying to do is end the need for foreign aid by promoting the self-reliance of the countries where we work. And that's a sensible thing to do. And if you go on USAID's website, you can see roadmaps for the 120 countries where USAID is providing aid, and see where they are on this journey to self-reliance in terms of their capacity and their commitment to solving their own development problems. It's good. But it's clouded by the White House. And I'm going to end on a not so happy note. My last assignment was Sri Lanka, 2016 to early 2018. And the priority in Sri Lanka was reconciliation. The war ended, 26-year war ended in 2009. It was a brutal civil war. and it ended in a really ugly way. And the government that ended the war remained in power through 2015, and they were very, very repressive. And their human rights violations were egregious. So as a result, the U.S. relationship with the Sri Lankan government tanked, and U.S. aid was shutting down. 2015, there was an election, and this bad guy thought he was going to waltz to a third term, and he lost. And a new guy came in who said all the right things about reform and reconciliation and human rights. So then Secretary of State Kerry said, don't close USAID, let's rebuild it and focus on reconciliation. So I was about to retire out of Indonesia, but I withdrew my retirement plans and went to Sri Lanka to rebuild USAID. We had a lot of money, we were hiring staff, we were building up. 1 year later, Trump is elected, and he said we're going to cut foreign aid as well as the diplomacy budget 31% globally, and we're going to eliminate USAID in Sri Lanka. This was a difficult situation. So there was a headline, right after I arrived, there was a front page story in a leading local newspaper, you know, USAID resurgence. A year later, the same newspaper, left side of the front page is a repeat of that story, and the right side of the front page is USAID going to zero. That was not an easy thing to explain as USAID director to Sri Lankans. And what I could say was not, I think Trump is wrong or I think he's an idiot. All I could say is, stay tuned, because the budget's actually determined by the Congress. And that's what I want to talk about for a minute. Lindsey Graham and Patrick Leahy are the two most important people on Capitol Hill for foreign aid. And depending on who's in the majority, they lead the foreign appropriations, the Senate Appropriations Committee's subcommittee for foreign operations. And in a lot of areas, they don't get along. But when it comes to foreign aid, there is very strong bipartisan support on Capitol Hill for foreign aid. And as you can see, these two guys work together closely, and their professional staff work together closely. So when Trump announced he wanted to cut foreign aid worldwide and eliminate it in Sri Lanka, Graham sent out his top professional staffer immediately to Sri Lanka to build an argument why it would be ridiculous to eliminate foreign aid. So we briefed him on our aid programs. But what was most persuasive was a larger strategic argument, which is China. Sri Lanka is also in a strategic location. Over half of the world's container traffic and over half the world's oil shipments go within 10 miles of the Sri Lankan coast. The Chinese, through what we call debt diplomacy, have been taking control over a lot of assets in Asia and Africa, including the Hambantota port. The previous president took on a lot of loans from the Chinese government, and the new government couldn't pay off the loans. So one way the Chinese made a deal was saying, well, you give us the port for 99 years and we'll write off some of your debt. So when the Secretary of State was testifying before Graham on the foreign aid budget, he said, you can't cut the aid to Sri Lanka because of China. We need to maintain our influence in China. So this is a tough time to work as a diplomat or in foreign aid overseas. Countries don't know what we're going to do. We're not a reliable partner. And diplomats need to publicly toe the party line. We can still do programs. We can still work with the Congress and hopefully get a better outcome. But planning these days is tougher, and having reliable partnerships is harder. So that's my presentation. I'm sorry to end on a sad note.
Trump's reason for cutting the aid to Sisson? Did he give a reason?
Well, in general, he just thinks foreign aid is a waste. The question was, why did Trump want to cut aid to Sri Lanka?
It wasn't only Sri Lanka.
No, he wanted to cut it to several countries. And he wanted to cut it globally by 31%, and then he targeted certain countries for eliminating. One, broadly, he just thought foreign aid is a waste of money.
No, but why did he?
But Sri Lanka specifically, well, one argument could be, well, it's a middle-income country. Their social indicators are pretty good. That was one reason. Yes?
So I was wondering, your objectives are promoting American interests abroad, and does that mean that you're courting popular opinion or focused more on the government, the local government, or do they interact? So how is the result of our infusion, of U.S. infusion of aid resources disseminated with knowledge in the country, and what effect does it have?
So we design our programs in consultation with host governments as well as other parts of society. It could be local groups, religious organizations, private sector, universities, to figure out what their interests are. Where are their U.S. interests? Where do they overlap? And then if there's an overlap, what are we better at, or what can the British do and we don't need to do it? So there's that sort of triangulation process to figure out what we're going to do. And then, and then for each of those investments, we have metrics. What do we want to achieve in the projects, and then are we achieving them or not? But I would go back to the broader question about foreign policy and how do you assess whether is foreign aid successful in promoting our foreign policy? And going back to Somalia, if you looked at our project performance, by and large it was pretty bad. In terms of supporting a dictator whose support we wanted for the Cold War and having port access against the Soviet Union, was very successful. Same thing with Mobutu. And I mean, it's an unsavory side of foreign policy and foreign aid. But that's how we are assessed as well. You're not going to see in a USAID report, did we prop up this dictator for 10 years? But if you look at strategy documents for a region and for State Department and for AID, it's going to have the range of objectives that we're working on, as well as development projects per se. In terms of how do people learn about it and the results, we do in country quite a bit of publicity for our projects. We're required to. Mission directors are in the media quite a bit. We do lots of ribbon cuttings. We put out reports. If we're doing good things or we're getting good results, we want people to know about it. And when Congress visits us, they want to be sure that we're doing that. Yes?
Does the White House have any power through executive order to influence the USAID budget?
Yes. It's a dance with the Congress, but in certain ways very much so. A classic example is concerning abortion. Whenever a Republican president comes into power, the first thing they do, or about the first thing they do, is sign a directive saying USAID will not support organizations that provide services related to abortion. We need to stop our programs with those organizations. It could be even counseling, even it's referrals. And then when the Democratic administration comes in, they reverse it. So that's a really good example. But another way is just priorities. This administration is not terribly interested in foreign aid. They're very interested in promoting U.S. business. we're always interested in promoting markets for U.S. business, but it may not be as ascendant as it is now. Yes?
You mentioned OPEC before, and I was just wondering, with U.S. foreign aid, it seems to me that the government throws the money in, from what you were saying, and it depends on the politician on top on how successful that could be. Where with OPEC, it's more of a private capital, public capital mixture for a commercial purpose. And I was just wondering which you thought left the most positive long-term results for the people in these countries, with not regardless to what we would like them to do, but
They do different things.
okay.
I mean, OPIC is about transactions. And some of them are really big transactions, and some of them work. USAID is more about systems change. There are obviously big exceptions, like building dams in Pakistan. But a lot of it's like improving an education system in Pakistan, or girls' education in Malawi. It's not, did we build a school? If it's infrastructure, it's did we build 500 schools? So we're doing different things. And both, depending on how well the projects are designed, they may be more or less successful depending on the circumstances.
Well, one costs us something and the other does not. That's,
Pardon?
I said one costs us something because of what we put into it. The other one makes a profit.
That's right. The USAID money is grant. It's pretty small compared to the US government budget. And depending on the study, you know, the rate of return on foreign aid, depending on the situation, is pretty high. And it dwarfs what's going through OPIC in terms of amount. But I also add just a nuance on what you said about the success of projects depending on people at the top. Leadership definitely matters, both in Washington as well as in host countries. But often success is really driven by people at lower levels. So for instance, in Indonesia, I found it increasingly difficult to work with the national government on issues like deforestation. But some sectors, like education, were very highly decentralized. And the authority for education sector decision-making was at the district level.
So
And there were some great people.
So Tib O'Neill was right.
Yes, you need to go local. Yes?
Other than typical issues like conflict, what did you find were the biggest roadblocks in establishing programs and implementing them among people?
The implementation issues on the ground as opposed to the politics before. Because the politics before sometimes was awful. Whether it was Pakistan or Kosovo, there was so much Washington and congressional interest that it's harder to reach decisions. So let's say you've got a decision, okay, we're going to do an education program in these countries. Then what are the challenges?
Yes.
Sometimes it's the bureaucracy in the host government. So they're often quick to sign an agreement. Sure, we want an education project, and they'll agree we're going to do, you know, these are the 5 objectives, and broadly how this is we're going to do it. But actually implementing it is very hard. And it's sometimes because their capacity to implement is limited. Either because they overpromise, or they have a bad bureaucracy, or corruption gets in the way. In Pakistan, we had a very difficult challenge where under the legislation, the Congress wanted us to put a lot of, and the White House wanted us to put a lot of our money directly to the Pakistani government. And the Pakistani government was highly corrupt. So on the one hand, they want us to give money directly to the Pakistanis to show our partnership and trust and alliance building. But on the other hand, they don't want our money to be stolen. So the way we would try to navigate that is by doing lots of assessments and then putting in place lots of procedures. So sure, we'll give them the money, but there are going to be these guardrails around it and all these checks. Those become very onerous in a place like Pakistan and very hard to get things done. In Pakistan, an added complication was the federal level government and the provincial governments sometimes didn't get along. So the bureaucracy would be like 2 square. And so that sometimes was a problem. I found it easier working with private companies and nonprofits, whether it's like Save the Children or a local nonprofit, who are really good at navigating that stuff. Yes?
What are some of your personal goals in retirement, given your 30 years of experience at USAID?
That's a nice question. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to share a little bit of what I learned.
With who?
Well, with you, but also with students. So one of my unusual and really great assignments when I was at USAID was I was on loan teaching at the National War College for a couple of years. And I liked it. So I wanted to try my hand at teaching, so I'm going to teach a course at UNC and a course at Duke, and just share. But one of the things that as I'm putting together the syllabus for each course, I really enjoyed learning and reading, and I've got a lot of stories, but it's a different thing to sort of look at the literature and other people's stories and then more scientific analysis. See, how does all of this add up? And I think having the opportunity to read about it and think about it, but then talk with students and faculty about it, and just share learning and experiences, I think that will be really interesting. And then I'm continuing to do some consulting. I'm working for a really fantastic nonprofit called FHI 360, which started out working on family health, but has expanded into education and democracy building and environment and other sectors. And I'm doing a few little things with that. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you ever ran into conflicts with other government departments like the CIA or Defense Department, or where those
Kevin's joking, never.
I assume you did. That's why
we
I wanted
did.
to hear more stories.
We did. Well, I'm retired, so I guess I can tell you more of what I really think. So, in Kosovo, there wasn't Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan on our agenda in those days. Kosovo was the big flavor of the month. And it was in the middle of NATO, and it was a really big deal. So we had endless visitors from Washington, Congress, the administration, and what I would joke, friends of Bill. Bill Clinton had countless coordinators running around the Balkans, telling people like me what to do. There was this real estate developer from California who was telling us that we needed to privatize the steel plant in Montenegro. And he was making a deal with the Montenegrin government to privatize the steel plant. This was insane. So we had people off making deals, and it was sometimes out of control. And a lot of people, I remember with the military, we worked very closely in many ways in Kosovo, but at other times there'd be generals running around. They'd meet some local leader who would say, can't you please rebuild our municipal building that got destroyed in June? And the general would say, well, I can't do it, but the USAID guys will handle it. That happened all the time. And in Pakistan, it was even worse. We had, when I arrived, 146 projects on our books, most of which were promises made by other agencies. And they weren't moving. So the challenge was figuring that out. And sometimes it was as simple as just building good teamwork and and working through it. Sometimes it was personalities. It was easier in places like Malawi, where we didn't have a lot of foreign policy interests, so Washington wasn't very involved. And the ambassador, we had one ambassador after another, both were fantastic. They knew a lot about Africa, they cared a lot about development, they were very supportive, they didn't micromanage us, it was perfect. And I remember Senator Nancy Kassebaum coming out from Kansas to visit our projects. It was fantastic. I mean, she really cared, she knew a lot. She didn't tell us what to do, but she had some good ideas. It was great. That's totally different from a highly political assignment like Kosovo or Pakistan.
Well, some of the projects you do are rather long-term. Which of the players or interests in Washington are the most interested in the real outcomes of the project and less so the flash or the publicity?
Within the administration, from the head of AID down through the technical staff and the desk officers, there is a genuine interest in the performance of the projects. And we need to do annual reports, project by project, on what they're achieving. And it's not just we spent $5 million, but schools built or kids learning more in school. We have a report on that. And even at the higher levels, people read it. Also, though, there are a lot of outside groups that pay very close attention to foreign aid. I mentioned Save the Children. Besides implementing projects and designing projects with us, doing humanitarian relief with us, they work on policy. Save the Children is on the advisory council of USAID. And those reforms that I showed you on the penultimate slide, Save the Children had a hand in that. So there are think tanks and outside actors who follow very closely what we do. And they hold us to account. Did I answer your question? Anything else?
So, one more question.
Go to the back.
On the ground, when you're in country, how do you handle and navigate the complex ethnic realities or tensions, whether it be Somalia with the clans or in Sri Lanka with the Sinhalese and the Tamils? How do you try to bridge that and just navigate the different factions, especially when there's been violence for so long?
In Somalia, we were pretty bad at it. I think our sort of sophistication in understanding these issues as an agency, and me personally, has slowly improved over time. So like in Kosovo, it's classic. The Albanians, the Serbs, the Roma, the Bosniaks. We read a ton. We spoke to people in the think tanks. We spoke to experts, local and international, to learn as much as we could. And we spoke to the other players. Even the US military might have an expert in this, or the Brits, or the UN. So we were always talking with each other, trying to understand. Bringing them together is what we'd like to do. Get the different groups who've been fighting each other, actually sit down and talk. And we did that a lot. And it was really hard. I remember these meetings where we would have 5 languages with 5 interpreters. So can you imagine how much you get done in a meeting with 5 languages? But that's what we did. And politically, we needed to be politically correct and do that. We tried to, one way that worked in Kosovo was we tried to support courageous moderates who were willing to go across the line. We did that a lot. If we could find a mayor in a Serbian town that was willing to work with Albanians and willing to, say, support a democratic election when Belgrade was telling him to stay clear, have nothing to do with Kosovo. We found leaders like that and we supported them. We would rebuild their schools and their water supplies and their radio stations, and we'd send them on trips to the United States. I went with, there was a really courageous prime minister, the first elected ethnic Albanian prime minister in the history of Kosovo. I went with him to a Serbian enclave. He actually came in my fully armored vehicle. And I said, what are you worried about, you nervous about going? This is the first time this has ever happened. I said, yeah. You know what's going to happen? I have no idea. He went, he had guts. He sat down with local Serbian leaders and it was on TV and they just talked. It's fantastic. So we would do what we could to support people like that, whether it was with projects or finance or just moral support, just listening. Depends. I mean, I think we did pretty well in Kosovo. One last example is, Sri Lanka with the horrific attacks that just took place, which really is heartbreaking. We worked on that a lot. And at the national level, we weren't getting anywhere. We were trying really hard, but the government just didn't have the wherewithal. It wanted to do the right thing, but there were powers in the military and elsewhere, they just didn't have the ability. But we did a lot at the local level. We worked with Sri Lankan think tanks and nonprofits that brought together religious leaders, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, literally all four, sit down around a table in village after village, talk about their problems, and predict or try to defuse conflicts before they got out of hand. Some of that worked. Not as much as I would.
So we'll see everybody in September, and please join me in thanking Cousin Andrew.